to have you with us today. If you're on the East Coast, I'll say good afternoon. I'm Warren Smith from Charlotte, North Carolina. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Warren Smith, and I'm the Vice President for Mission Advancement at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. I'm coming to you from Charlotte, North Carolina, so I can say good afternoon, but I know that Sean McDowell and J. Warner Wallace are on the West Coast, and they're probably late morning there, so good late morning to you guys. And wherever you are in this country, we've had over 1,200 people sign up from virtually all over the country. We are excited to have you with us to talk today about Jim and Sean's latest book, which is So the Next Generation Will Know, Preparing Young Christians for a Challenging World. I've read this book. I'm excited about this book. We at the Colson Center are excited about this book, and that's why we are offering it as our donor premium for the month of July. And what that means is that for a donation of any size to the Colson Center, we're going to send you a free copy of this book. I'm going to say more about how you can do that, how you can get your own copy of this book later in the hour, but I want to get Jim and Sean up here just as quickly as possible to get us started in our conversation. Before I do that, though, a couple of quick housekeeping items. Number one of the great values of the technology that we're using, this Zoom technology, this webinar technology, is that it's interactive, it's live, and you can ask questions. Now, depending upon the device you're using, but I think for most people it would be at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a little tab that says Q&A. If you'll click on that, a box will open up and you can type in questions. I will see those questions. In the last more or less half hour of our time together, we'll be dealing with the questions that you are asking. The first half hour will be mostly from Jim and Sean and me. And so with that, let me go ahead and get started. J. Warner Wallace is the author of a number of books. I think many of you would know him because of his book, Cold Case Christianity, and a number of books in that series. We have had Jim on the Colson Center short course before, and we're delighted to have you back on this particular technology with us again, Jim. So thanks for being with us.
Glad to be here. Yeah, really fun to be here.
And Sean McDowell, many of you know Sean because of the book, especially Colson Center followers will know Sean because of the book that he wrote with John Stonestreet called Same-Sex Marriage. But he's also the author of a whole bunch of other books, including a collaboration with his father, Josh McDowell, on the latest and greatest version of the classic book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. So, Sean, we are also excited to have you back. You've also been on a short course episode with us before, so thanks to both of you guys for being with us today.
Thanks for having me back.
Now, Jim, I want to start with you, but I want to ask the same question of both of you, and that is, why this book? What is it about your background and your ministry and what you're seeing today in the world that caused you and Sean to want to get together and write this particular book?
Well, I think part of it is I'm tied to Sean in a way that has been, our history goes back quite a bit, working with students. As a matter of fact, the reason why I wrote the first book, Cold Case Christianity, is because Sean and I were training students on our Berkeley trip, which we'll talk about, I'm sure, later. And Sean said to me, why don't you write a book about this? And I had never really thought about trying to write a book about some of the stuff that we were doing when we were training young people. At the time, I was a youth pastor, and I was involved training up my young people. I planted a church with college-age students after that. And so I had an expertise that I thought maybe I could tap into to write a book like this, given that Sean and I think probably the majority of our audiences, or at least half or more of our audiences, are young people in the age group that we're talking about in this book. We call it Gen Z, which the culture is calling either iGen or Gen Z. And these are folks that we are interacting with constantly and learning. And listen, we've stubbed our toe and train wrecked a number of ideas while working with these groups. So Sean came to me probably about 2 years ago and said, hey, we were both at Biola teaching in the apologetics program, and he's talking about starting a program for simply youth pastors who really need to know how to teach Christian worldview and apologetics to young people. And if we could just target youth pastors, we could probably transform a lot of youth groups. And I said to him at the time, I said, well, Sean, if we do this kind of a book, sadly, because I don't think a lot of youth pastors are even interested in apologetics, that probably has an audience of 10 people. How about if we expand this to parents and Christian educators and youth pastors? Because I think really the responsibility for most of us, for all of us as parents, is we have to be the best Christian apologist and worldview communicator that our kids will ever know. And that's really so we started collaborating a couple of years ago. and really just trying to tap into our experience as parents, our experience as youth pastors, our experience as Christian educators, because we've all worked in one or two of those fields. And really, as much of this is kind of a cautionary tale as it is a suggestion for how to move forward, because we've learned some things that help, and we've also learned what doesn't work. And so that's really where the book kind of came from.
Yeah, Sean, anything to add to that?
Well, the main reason for me was my son Scotty, who's 15, my daughter Shauna, who's 12, and my son Shane, who's almost 7. As a parent, I'm always looking for resources to be better at equipping them. And in particular, my kids were getting a lot older, and I started to notice just some change with Gen Z and a void of a book that said, here is timely advice related to Gen Z, but we're not reinventing the wheel. There's some timeless truths that go back to the time of Scripture and before. How do we put this in a resource? And I think what makes us unique is the other books that Jim and I have written are really like, here's truth about why the Bible is true. It's information about what. This is a how-to book with practical strategies anybody who cares about youth could take and put into practice. So it's kind of like Greg Koukl's book, Tactics, is not answering apologetic questions. It's saying, how do we actually put this into practice? And I wanted to write it because both Jim and I don't want to write any books other people have written before. We looked around, we're like, no one has actually done it in this fashion with real practical strategies. Again, youth pastors, parents, grandparents, mentors, anyone who cares about Gen Z. And I kind of thought, selfishly, if I research this myself and come up with answers, I'm pretty sure other people are asking the same question. And how well the book is done so far, I think, confirms there's a real hunger for this.
Yeah, you know, we've thrown, or you guys have thrown around an expression that I'm sure many of our viewers and listeners have heard before, but I want you to, especially Sean, if you could take the lead on this, to dive into that expression a little bit more deeply, and that is Gen Z. And can you differentiate Gen Z from millennials and baby boomers and Gen Xers or whatever the others nomenclature? Y'all do a really great job of that in the book, but can you give us a taste of that here?
Yeah, Gen Z would essentially be students today who are elementary students through college. So maybe 1995 or roughly 2000 to about 2010, in that range that they were born. So millennials are really out of college. They are old news in a sense in terms of when we talk about young people, it's Gen Z. Now, as Jim said, there's other labels. There's iGen, some have called it the selfie generation, post-millennials, the trans generation. But Gen Z, kind of the last name in the alphabet, kind of indicates that there's some radically new things taking place with this generation. And some have even argued it's the last generation that has distinct characteristic because of technology uniquely to that generation. But we could get into that. Essentially, Gen Z, think of like elementary, upper elementary through college students today.
Well, one of the technologies is technologies like the kind that we are on today, right? I mean, but more specifically, the iPhone. The iPhone came out in 2007, so we're talking about a generation that really grew up with the iPhone. They're digital natives, and the kind of bandwidth, internet bandwidth that would allow this kind of a technology, what we are using, didn't exist even as recently as 15 years ago. So that is part of why this generation is different from previous generations. Is that what you guys are saying, Jim?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. When we talk about being a digital native, I mean, what does that really then mean? It means a couple of things. Practically, it means that, yes, when you're a digital generation, you have a practical way that you access information. So we are creating information as authors, as speakers, as communicators, as creators of video, but it's different for this generation. Now think about this. I think every one of us my age has said, oh, come on. My generation I was at 15 at one point. Yeah, but I'll tell you what, we have experienced a real cultural shift that is equivalent to like the transportation cultural shift. It might have taken back then 3 generations for our great-grandparents and great-great-grandparents to move from wagons and horses to cars. But this cultural shift in technology just takes about 5 years for everyone to shift into a completely new way of digesting information. And that's what our young people are. And listen, and Sean's done a great job too over the years collecting this data, and we talk about it in the book, that defines what is different about this generation. If you think that, hey, this generation really sees the same challenges that my generation did, well, in some sense that's true. But how that's expressed in a digital age is very different. And that's what we have to understand as parents, as pastors, as educators, to help us move forward and communicate to this generation.
You know, one of the things that I love about this book, you guys, and I want you to maybe speak to it just a little bit, and Sean, I'll start with you, is that you divided the book into two sections. The first section is really about relationships before you get more towards the information. It's more about do you love me? And how do we show our love to people before we start really pouring information in them? And it seems to me that that's one of the shifts of the digital native, which is that they don't lack for information. In fact, if anything, the real problem is that they've got too much information, that they need real relationships with people that they can trust, who that they know love them. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, that's right. The way you frame this generation, the question is, how does this digital technology shape the way they think, for one, and second, shape the way they build relationships? So it shapes their relationships. I was having a conversation with a student this summer, and he was telling me about his best friend, all about him, and et cetera. And finally I stopped. I said, have you ever met your best friend? He goes, no, we just talk online. And I thought, oh my goodness. Technology has utterly changed not only a friend on Facebook, but a best friend you've never met. So there's this relational side that is changed by the digital technology, but also changes the way we think. And so one of the examples we use in the book is, most people watching this will remember these Coke versus Pepsi commercials. And the idea was, if you want a soda, you really have two options. That's it. Well, today, buy your own soda making machine. The fizz you want, the size you want, personalized just for you. Or you can buy a Coke with your name on it. You know, Starbucks has 87,000 different drink options. This generation has been raised having what they want, when they want it, how they want it, where they want it. And this teaches them to see the world a certain way. So how do we minister to a generation that has information overload? And in one sense, our response is timely, the way we frame the book, but I also think it's timeless, because there's two truths. One is we have to build relationships with this generation to have the relational capital to even be able to speak into their lives. Yeah. Now, this has always been true, but it's more true today because there's a million voices out there. And I ask myself, why should young people I speak to listen to me? And a lot of that is because there's a relationship, or sometimes even a perceived relationship. And second, it's worldview. Because there's so much information, young people need a belief system to say what is good, what is bad, what is right, what is wrong, what is valuable. So we frame the book in terms of relationship. Love trains, love understands, love equips, because we want to teach worldview and truth to this generation, but it must be through intentional relationships. And we have a chapter on relationships. So there's some truths you'd say, oh, these are timeless. And there's others you'd say, oh, this is a unique way to build a relationship with this generation. So that's why we framed it that way.
Yeah.
Jim, you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this issue, and I think that sometimes parents, especially when we go to events and we're speaking about these topics, and there's always a set of parents in the audience who feel a little bit like they had some regret. Maybe they didn't feel like they did a good enough job with their kids, or they're worried about the future of their kids. And they think that it's in some ways lost because maybe now they've got a 22-year-old or a 24-year-old and they maybe aren't in the church anymore. And I get that. I was 35 before I became a Christian. So I know what it is to be an adult unbeliever. But I want to share hope with parents, because it turns out what we're talking about, this connection between truth and relationship, is so foundational that you can find all the information. You can get this truth claims online, but you have no relationship with those ministries or those organizations that are offering the truth claims. So they are truth claims minus a relationship. And at home, sometimes as a parent, we can build a relationship, but are we authoritative when it comes to the question that kids want answered? Do we have enough? Do we know enough to be able to offer the truth claim? So what I always tell people is, that online source, I don't care what they do, they're never going to be able to develop the relationship side of this. You own that. You could own that. All you have to do is become authoritative on the topic. So it's about us uniting these two things, relationship and truth, in a way that the internet's never going to be able to do. And I think that this is a generation that is I had the same kind of conversation with a student at Summit last time I was at Summit Worldview Conference about this idea that you can call somebody you don't know, you've never been in physical proximity with, your best friend. Okay. But that and even if that's true, if you had a friend you were that close with who you could also share physical proximity with, that will end up trumping your online relationship. I still believe that physical proximity, and parents, we have that. Youth pastors, you have that. Christian educators, you have that. Have you taken the time? Sometimes as an educators they've got the topic, the truth claim down, but they maybe have not built the relationships. As a youth pastor, what I'm seeing is people who build the relationships, but maybe don't know how to answer the questions. All I'm suggesting, and we're trying to do in this book, is to show how both of those things, when they're put together, are incredibly influential. Let's don't lose sight of that.
You know, Jim said something, Sean, just a few moments ago about, it's possible that people are listening and watching us right now. And, there's fear in their lives. They need hope because they've got a wayward child or a wayward young person in their life, and they're not sure how to respond. Maybe others, they do have folks in their lives that they're doing a good job with, but they just want to do a little bit of a better job. And maybe somewhere, there are folks somewhere in between. But especially that first category of folks reminded me of a story, Sean, you tell in the book about you and your dad, and the relationship that you shared. I believe it was when you were about 19 years old, and you started expressing doubts to your father. And of course, your father is Mr. Christian apologist Josh McDowell. Can you say more about that story?
Sure, I can. And let me frame one thing you said, that parents can often be motivated by fear. I find myself falling into this as well, but just remember, 1 John 4:18 says, perfect love casts out fear. That's why we frame the book as love, because Jim and I fall short on this all the time, but that's our goal, to respond in love. And that's what my father did. When I came to him as a 19-year-old, I had gotten online, and this is kind of in the mid-90s when you could really first search for like web pages, pre-Google. And I discovered that the secular web was built upon responding chapter by chapter to my dad's book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Doctors, lawyers, scientists, historians. I'm 19 years old, and I'm reading this stuff that I look back on now, and I'm like, I can't believe I fell for that. But as a 19-year-old, it was really unsettling to me. It was the first time I ever thought, wow, I could be wrong about this. And so I felt like I just needed to come clean, so to speak, and tell my dad what I was feeling. And we were in Breckenridge, Colorado, up in the mountains. And we went out for coffee, and I just kind of said something effective, Dad, I want to know it's true, but I'm not sure I'm convinced Christianity is really true. And my dad is a person that's like, the glass is 98% full. And he looks at me, he goes, son, I think that's great. And I was like, did you hear what I just said? He goes, son, I think it's great. I've taught you to love truth. You can't live on my convictions. You have to discover for yourself if you think this is really true. And as a dad, all I want you to do is love and seek after truth. I'm proud of you if you do that. And then says something like, look, if you seek after truth, I'm confident you will keep believing in or be led to Jesus, because Jesus is the truth, and know that your mom and I love you no matter what. And that was, I knew my parents loved me. That was never a question, but that was a very affirming moment. And I don't think I stopped believing, but that was a point I was like, I got to find out for myself what I really believe and why. Now, probably 2 or 3 years ago, I asked my dad, I was like, Dad, what were you really thinking when I said that? I mean, you must have been a little worried. And he goes, honestly, son, I was. And I said, why? And he said, because of the depth of relationship that you and I had and still have. And it really hit me. I was like, wow, he's right. Like, truth is so best learned in the context of relationship. And this is scriptural. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians 2:8-9, Paul says, we gave you not only the gospel truth, but our very own lives relationship. Jesus came in grace, and he came in truth. So I tell parents, I say, if your kids come to you and they doubt, the most important thing is to just say, I love you through this. This will never change, and stand by them and realize it might be a process, But that love and that commitment and not freaking out, as hard as that may be, is probably the best response we can give.
Well, what a powerful story. And, for me as a parent, now, by God's grace, my kids are following the Lord. And I sometimes tell people that God gave me good kids because I'm not smart enough to raise bad kids but I know that a lot of parents out there, godly parents that have done everything they know how to do to raise their kids, sometimes their kids wilt out, and there is a challenge in that relationship. And Sean, your story with your dad gave me so much hope, and I really appreciated the transparency, the way you told that story. And Jim, you mentioned a little bit about your salvation experience that came, I won't say late in life, because you're not late in life even now, but at least we hope and pray. But you certainly weren't. You certainly were a child. And in fact, I think at some point in the book, or maybe it was in a speech that you give, that there were a lot of people in your life that if you asked to name the person least likely to become a Christian, that they probably would have named you.
Yeah, and I think this is where I want to just cast some hope for people. When you write a book like this, there's always fear, and Sean and I talked about this, that we're going to be writing something that a lot of parents are going to see as a burden, right? In other words, I don't need another book that's going to tell me everything I messed up doing with my kids, because now I got teenagers. Now I should have started this when they were 10. I don't need another book that's going to make me feel bad for what I did or didn't do. I also need another book that's going to give me 80 things now I need to add to my life to be effective in raising my kids and in communicating the Christian worldview. And that is not what we wrote here. What we kind of see is that this is not a matter of you adding a bunch of stuff to your life. Now, certainly some of us are inclined to do that anyway, but what it's really about is you leveraging opportunities that you have not been seeing. And, when I was not a Christian, I would never have attributed anything to God's intervention in anyone's life, right? So I was a completely committed philosophical naturalist. When things happened, I would say it's either chance or you knocked over a domino 4 years ago, this is where it leads. I would have attributed something, no matter what happens, good or bad in someone's life, to just natural forces and processes in the universe. That's all that was available to me as somebody who did not believe in anything supernatural. Even after becoming a Christian, even now, okay, I became a Christian at 35, I'm 58. I still have a hard time seeing God's intervention, because I'm still like wired from 35 years to write everything off to not see the miraculous nature of what God is doing even in my own life. In other words, I have to make an intentional effort to see through a lens that allows me to see God's miraculous work in my life, because if I'm not careful, I will default back to my atheism. Well, what we're trying to do with the book like this is to say, hey, there are opportunities that you've been walking right by that you can leverage to share the Christian worldview with your kids, but you may not have been sensitive to seeing them. So all we're going to do is help you to shift the same way people in my life helped me to shift to see that, no, that's actually God working in your life. So I was able to see things I didn't see before. Well, what we were trying to do with the book like this is help you to see opportunities you didn't see before. So now you're like, oh, that's what we talked about in the book. That's what Sean wrote about in the sidebar. That's an opportunity that I could do like they did and talk about the Christian worldview in light of what's happening right now in the car, at the dinner table, in front, after walking back from a movie or listening to a song. Or these are opportunities that have been there all along that we just have not leveraged for the glory of God, right? So what we're trying to do in a book like this is, that's not burdensome, by the way. All we're doing is working smarter, not working harder. And so that's, and I learned this kind of coming out of this, 35 years of not seeing God in any action in my life, not being able to connect the things of God to the song I was listening to or to the new movie I just watched. Look what Sean's wearing on his shirt, for crying out loud. I cannot get Sean to, his whole wardrobe is dictated by Marvel Comics. Okay. I mean, seriously.
Or not a little DC.
DC, okay, whatever. The point is, this is, but what he's doing is he's leveraging the conversations of culture that occur all around us in media, in politics, and all these things that happen all around us. And don't think for a second your kids aren't aware of these. Don't think for a second there isn't a meme out there that some other 17-year-old has just produced and it's on social media and everyone's laughing about it. Don't think there's not an opportunity for you to leverage what the culture is saying for the glory of God. And so that's what we're trying to do with a book like this, is to help you see those moments are available to you now.
Well, we've got a lot of questions, and we're already 25 after the hour. So, but there are 2 or 3 things that I wanted to talk about before I open the floor to questions. By the way, let me just remind everyone that there is a Q&A button on your screen. If you'll click there, I can see the questions here. As I said, we've had a lot of questions already come in, and we'll transition into that part of our time in just a moment. But if there are 2 or 3 things I'd like to. First of all, we can't really unpack this book completely, and this book I found it just to be extraordinarily nourishing. But a couple of things that I wanted to mention. Jim, you mentioned one of them, and that is the sidebars. One of the things that I found really interesting as a feature of this book, and I'm not sure that people can see it, are these sidebars that you put in there. And so, for example, this one, if you're a Christian educator, poll your students. It's just some real practical advice here. And you've got sidebars, if not on every page, probably on every 3rd or 4th page at a minimum throughout the book. What was the thinking behind putting those sidebars in there? Sean, do you want to start off with that? Maybe Jim can pick up from there.
Yeah, the idea was to give people real practical ways to put into practice the thinking and reasoning of that particular chapter. So in every chapter, we have a sidebar like for a Christian educator, for a parent, for a youth pastor. And these are just very practical things that we've done in the classroom, mentoring a student, speaking to students, whatever it is, that someone could walk away today and put this into practice. So Jim was really hitting on this earlier, but the last chapter of the book, I say, at this stage, if you stayed with us, you might feel overwhelmed. All we want you to do is take 1 or 2 things and do them. That's it. You don't have to do everything here. Try 1 or 2. If it doesn't work, try something else. If it works, keep doing it. So these sidebars are real practical ways to put into practice building relationships, teaching worldview, training young people. And they're on the sidebar so people can read them and come back to them and just put it right into their life and work with students.
Mm.
Yeah, and by the way, the reason why we did that is because each of us has had a role in one of those 3 areas, right? Either we're both parents. My kids are now 30 to 22. So we've both been parents. I was their youth pastor when they were growing up. So I've had some time as a youth pastor, so has Sean. Sean has spent years working as a Christian educator at high school level. And I remember when my daughter was going through, we were taking these trips to Berkeley, she got connected to Sean, and then she wanted to go to that school. Really? So now I got to send her to this school. So I sent her to Sean's school. And then when Sean would go on trips, he would ask me to sub for him. So we've all had these experiences where we've intersected on these issues that we hope. And I always say it this way, to be wise is to learn from mistakes, but they don't have to be your mistakes. You can get wise learning from the mistakes of others. And so a lot of what we're trying to show here is, and by the way, when we say just put 1 or 2 of these things into practice, that's because in a given calendar month, we didn't do anything more than put 1 or 2 of these things into practice. It's not like you can, we might be able to plumb the depth of all things you could do. But when push comes to shove, we're only going to pick 2 or 3 of these things ourselves that we're going to implement in any calendar month. And they would be different month to month. So it's not as hard as you might think. And because it's built on the rails of you developing the strongest relationship you can with your kids, and then just grabbing enough authority, you don't have to be a mile ahead of your kids to lead them, because if you're a mile ahead and you make a turn, they're not going to see you turn. You just need to be a few feet ahead of the person you're leading. So you might think, I don't know anything about that topic. How long would it really take you to get a couple of feet ahead of your kids on that topic? And you already have the relationship built. Now you have the authority you can attach to the relationship. You're good to go.
And Warren, can I give a practical example of what you'll find here? Because that's why we wrote the book. 2 things this summer that I did with my kids one was in spring. My son was 14. He came to me and he wanted to see this movie, Bohemian Rhapsody, which is about the rock band Queen. And I was a little bit skeptical because I think there's some cultural and sexual agendas in this movie. Read about it. I'm like, okay, this is doable for a 14-year-old. So I said, I'll take you and a friend if you're just willing when it's done. Just sit down with me for 20, 30 minutes and we'll just talk about it. I'm not going to lecture you, but I just want to know what you see in the movie. How should we think about it as Christians? What do we learn? What might we differ with the film? He goes, sure. So I paid for him, brought a friend, bought popcorn, went, came back, and he honored it. We sat down 20, 30 minutes. We just talked about it. It's just an opportunity. If I had not been thinking this way, I wouldn't have seen it. Another example, my daughter this summer said she wanted these Birkenstock shoes, which are not cheap for a 12-year-old. And I said, all right, here's the deal. if you want to get these Birkenstock shoes, I wanted to teach her that you got to work for something. And I thought I kind of want to teach her worldview. So I said, tell you what, if you watch 50 PragerU videos, these 4 or 5 minute videos, kind of like what you're developing at the Colson Center right now. Joseph Backholm is developing these. I said, if you watch 50 of them, you write a summary for each one, and then you have to talk to me, your mom, your grandma, or your papa about each one, just so we understand you get it. I'll buy you the shoes. It took her like 3 weeks. She went through 50 of these on political issues, cultural issues, relational issues, and we're having all these conversations. And finally, just last week, she finished and she's getting her shoes. So Jim is exactly right how he framed it. We're not asking you to add all this new stuff, but to just look around in the relationships we have with kids and be thinking about opportunities that may be there and not exasperate our kids if we make everything worldview, we're going to overdo it. I spend a lot more time talking with my son, want to talk about Stranger Things. My daughter wants to talk about volleyball. I do all those relationship things so then I get those moments of opportunity to feed into their lives.
Well, I just love what you guys have said just now, because you're really talking about, if I could say it this way, playing the long game with your kids and understanding that if you'll just deviate a course 1 or 2 degrees today, that years from now, you'll be in a very different place. It's like the old sailor knows that, you just move 1 or 2 degrees and you'll be hundreds of miles from where you would have been otherwise. And I find that encouraging. To know that I don't have to accomplish everything today with my kids or with my grandkids, that I can play the long game with them as long as I continue to focus on that relationship aspect of it. Final question I want to ask before we turn over to the Q&A from the audience. Jim, you've mentioned a couple of times these trips to Berkeley, and y'all talk about those trips in this book so the next generation will know. You call them tab trips in the book. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so TAB is basically just the way I would structure my curriculum, structure my scope of curriculum for my students when I was a youth pastor. I knew that this important Christian worldview was going to sit on 3 legs. This stool was going to sit on 3 legs: theology, the T; apologetics, the A; and behavior, the B. And although my parents were really more concerned about would our youth ministry produce good behaving students, I knew that that's not going to happen unless you can build this on the T and the A. But I also knew that, as a first responder, I am required by post-certification in California to attend a certain number of training days annually. And these training days that I attend are meaningful for first responders because we know we are probably going to face that situation tomorrow in the street. So when we're doing pursuit driving courses once every 2 years, we do that because more than likely I'm going to put my red lights and siren on tomorrow night. And so I'm going to need to learn how to cut corners, how to close a gap on a car, all those kinds of things we talk about in pursuit driving. In other words, because we know we're going to have to implement this in a challenge that we see in our head is already on our calendar. I got to work tomorrow night. That's what makes this thing more than teaching. It makes it training because we are getting ready for a calendared challenge. And so what TAB training is it allows us to put a calendared event downstream on our calendar. We put 3 a year, usually about 5, because we did more of the behavioral side than we did the other 2 because they were easier to implement. And we would take trips that specifically created a theological challenge for our students, an apologetics challenge for our students, a behavioral challenge for our students. And then we would spend 8 to 10 weeks preceding the trip to prepare our students to engage the challenge. And they all were nervous about it at first because they know this is going to be hard to do, but they were also excited about it because these were trips that we took the kids away. They couldn't sleep at home. They were going to be gone from home for a week. And they were going to be, for example, one would be to go to either on well, for us in Southern California, we're only about 12 hours away from Salt Lake City. Great place to take kids to be saturated in another theological worldview and interact with people and have to really know your stuff because they see you as the lost people group. So I think it's really a place we can do that kind of challenge. And we did one in Berkeley for the apologetics. We would take kids to Skid Row and to work with ministries like the Orange County Rescue Mission that were more about behavior, social justice, taking care of the poor. What is it? How do you love your neighbor? These kinds of things we would do, and we would put them on the calendar. Now, I will tell you when we started, because we are here in Southern California, I had a pastor who was incredibly good surfer. And everything we did as a church was board sports. It was wakeboarding, surfboarding, and surfing. It was snowboarding in the winter. It was skateboarding in between. And we replaced systematically all of those trips with these kinds of tab training trips, to the point where I thought, are we going to lose a bunch of students? Now, certainly, if that's all you're interested in is board sports, then you might miss. But if once you just go on one of those tab trips, just one, you would find yourself go, oh, nobody ever wanted to go back to the old way of doing trips. And so these became such a challenge, and students felt like they were transformational in their lives to like, you know what? I started to order our entire calendar year, because we only had a few weeks in between the training process that would, the next trip's coming up in 3 months, and we got to train for 8 weeks. That's 2 months. There's not a lot of time in between the training. And so really the lion's share of our scope and curriculum as a youth pastorate was spent training and preparation for a trip. It changed everything we did. So this idea of what it is to train as opposed to teach is something we talk about in one chapter in the book. And then we really went as deep as we could go in showing you how, because you might think as a parent, well, I can't take that kind of, I don't have that kind of expertise. I get it. It turns out there are smaller things you can do that become the challenge you can put on the calendar that will it'll change the way you talk about Christian things with your own kids. And we get that. So we want to offer alternatives that aren't going to take you a day, aren't going to take you 3 weeks or 3 days or 4 days or whatever it is to train. There are some things you can do now as long as you're willing to see the challenge on the calendar changes everything.
Well, we've got a lot of questions from the audience, and I want to get there. Before I do, though, just a bit of shameless self-promotion here. I know, Sean and Jim, you do these trips, at least some of these trips, with our good friend Brett Kunkel, and the two of you and Brett are going to be at our Wilberforce weekend next year, doing the entire Friday pre-conference with John Stonestreet and a couple of others. So I couldn't resist sort of getting, since you mentioned these trips, and I knew Brett would often go on these trips with you, get that little bit of promotion in there. Go to wilberforceweekend.org, sign up for next year's Wilberforce weekend. It's a long ways away. It's in May of next year, but we've already got more than 100 people signed up for next year's Wilberforce weekend, and we're hoping to have 900 to 1,000 in total. So we probably will sell out just because of the size of the venue. So this will be an opportunity for many of our watchers and listeners to get a head start and get a chance to see you two guys face to face, and read this book will be great, sort of pre-reading, a prerequisite for that event. Let me jump straight into the questions, if I could, guys, because we've got more than 20 questions that have already shown up, and not sure we'll be able to get them all, but maybe I'll be able to condense a few of them. We did get a lot of questions, probably 4 or 5 at least. There's one from Todd, and I see Michelle here, and Christo, all kind of in the same ballpark of trying to talk about this relationship, or this idea of truth and love, or being uncompromising with the truth, while also understanding what the implications of being forceful with the truth might have on relationships. Can you say more about that, Sean? Why don't you take a first stab at that? And how do you do that? How do you speak the truth in love in ways that preserve the relationship that you want to build and maintain with young people in your life?
Well, I think the key is the deeper the relationship, the more you have the right to speak truth, and the more young people will listen. So that's why oftentimes before I speak a hard truth to a young person, I want to make sure that they know that I care about them. So sometimes I might say to a young person, do you know that I care about you? And they'll say yes. I'll say, good. I'm going to share something with you just with some perspective of life, being a husband, being a father, because I care about you, and how you respond is up to you. But I hope you'll take it the way that I intended it to be taken. And then I'll speak into them. Now, the question was, how do we share truth and preserve the relationship? That's the goal, but we can't guarantee that that's going to happen. All we can control is that we really love people. And the other key is to just use wisdom when we have this conversation, where we have this conversation. Sometimes before having a conversation like that, I'll talk to other people, say, is my heart right? Am I saying the right thing? Make sure it's in the right place. and just approach with a heart of love. My dad, when he used to speak hard truths to me as a kid, he would say something like, do you know that I love you? Yeah. And then he'd say, do you want a marriage relationship, sex and marriage relationship in the future the way I have with your mom? I'd say, yeah. And then he'd speak truth, and it was something tied to relationships. And I didn't always want to hear it, but he framed it in the way of making sure the relationship was there, and it was. So I was just more likely to be receptive to it, even if it was hard for it to sink in over time, because I'm human. But that's the goal.
Yeah.
Yeah, but let me say something about that, though. When Sean says that his dad asked him that question, Sean was honestly able to say yes. So that's part of the challenge, right? Is that sometimes we're talking to people who know they have a broken relationship with their kids, and they feel like, hey, I wish there's something could change about my kids. Well, there's seasons when you're just going to have to spend time in relationship first to earn the equity. I will listen to what Sean says to me about my life, because Sean probably knows me as well, if not better, than a lot of other people, even in the industry of apologetics where we both work, right? We know a lot of people. But Sean knows me and knows my kids and knows my life well enough that I know he cares about me. And so if he says something, number one, he's invested time. It takes time to earn that. My dad right now is to get my dad to listen about the things of God up until very recently, I couldn't share a truth claim with him, but I knew I could continue to build the relationship during that season when he wasn't willing to listen about Jesus. And so I just spent years, we prepared for this, years developing that relationship with a man who is now 79. And I've been a Christian for 22 years, talking about this stuff in front of my dad. So it really comes down to, and again, look, if you were on a missions trip and you're out serving some community, but you never tell them about Jesus, well, then you've loved on them, but you haven't shared truth. On the other hand, if you're out there just trying to, on the corner, share the truth, I get that that's going to be powerful for some people, but you haven't invested in the relationship. I'm not saying you cannot be effective, but you will be strikingly less effective if you don't build on those two rails. And so I think this is about us deciding that it really examine, first of all, do you have the kind of relationship that when you ask your kids, do you know that I care, I love you? They will honestly be able to say that's a given. That is something that they are. Now, I think what happens as kids grow older, Sean knows this, I know this, there's a period of time when it seems like that there's a period of time in which you spread your wings. And if you ask your 10-year-old that question, you're likely to get a more honest, yeah, he knows you love him, or she knows you love him. You ask your 17-year-old that question, it can seem like it's a little more challenging. So this is why I would say that it's important for us to know enough about what is true to talk to our kids at a very young age, when they actually know that we love them. That's not a doubt. That's not an issue. We sometimes think, hey, well, I'll talk about those kinds of issues when they become a teenager. It's too late. It's not as though they haven't been examining these issues and talking to their friends about these issues when they were 10, 11, 12. That's happening. I wrote books for 8 to 12-year-olds because I knew that that's where we need to communicate these truths, because it turns out from 8 to 12, you are in one of the deepest relationships you have with your own kids, right? There's no challenge. There's no spreading their wings. There's no search for independence. A lot of things that become in the way for a season have not yet come in the way. And that's why I think we start early.
Well, that sort of nicely transitions into a question that we had from Brian. Sean, a couple of folks referenced that story with gratitude that you told about you and your dad, where you went to your dad and expressed some doubts, and your dad dealt with those doubts that you had in a very responsible way. And it was very encouraging to know that even the son of a world-famous evangelist has some doubts. So maybe if my kids have some doubts, it's okay. But what about the kid that won't express the doubt? What about the kid that has the doubts, and despite maybe your best efforts to surface those questions, they're just not coming. They're either their eyes glaze over, or they just don't care, or they're looking to other places as their authority. How can we ask questions or develop relationships with kids to maybe surface some of those doubts so that we actually have an opportunity to answer some of those questions?
Well, what Jim said is very important, that we start early. If you just start and your kid is 17, that's going to be a lot harder than when you start with a kid who's 6. So one thing I tell my kids all the time, because the number one place a kid looks with questions is not their pastor, it's not their teacher, it's not their parents, it's Google. And people are honest on Google because they feel like they're hidden and no one knows who they are. So I tell my kids, even very young, I say, you can ask your dad anything. I might not have the answer, but I'll tell you what I think. And no matter what they say, I'm not going to freak out. I'm just going to give them a response. I want them to know over and over again that they can comfortably come to me. So by the time they're 16, 18 and older, I think you have a better chance of them asking these questions. Now, can we force a kid who has doubts to not share them? I mean, people have free will. You can't force them. Jesus let the rich young ruler walk away from him because his heart simply wasn't there. I have friends who've done right now, a well-known person, probably everybody listening would know, who just told me recently, he said, my son just told me that he doesn't believe anymore. And that was heartbreaking. So you can do all these things, and it doesn't guarantee you're going to have an output of a kid that believes A, B, or C, but we can stand before the Lord and know that we've done our best and grace covers the rest. So it's at that point, if a kid won't express, you maybe just look for natural ways to share stories of your own doubt that doesn't seem forced. And you just let a kid know that you love them. And you got to build in that security, that love is unconditional and I care about you, and build in that safety. And so they know that when they're at the point ready to share, you will be there to listen to them and not freak out. So just have a longer term view rather than get frustrated if they don't ask that question today. Now, you might ask, in some circumstances, you can ask without going behind your kid's back. If you're really concerned, you might ask somebody else who has a relationship with that kid, a teacher or youth pastor. Hey, I'm a little concerned about Johnny. Have you been able to have any conversations? I don't want to destroy confidentiality here, but do you sense anything is going on I should be aware of? I think that's a fair question that parents can ask if they're not opening up to them. And to be honest with you, when I had those doubts, it's not like I went to my dad, the great apologist, was like, Dad, help me with the resurrection. Dad, help me with this. To be honest with you, that's when I started reading J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig. And other apologists had to say the same things that my dad had said. So I don't look at my dad as this great apologist. I look at him as my dad. And that's why you see in a lot of movies, this mentor comes around and trains a young person. So that's why I pray in my kids' lives for their coaches and teachers and other voices to speak, even if they're not necessarily speaking with me as much as I wish they would for a certain season.
Now, what he just said is incredibly important, and we take it for granted. When my son was, my boys are older by about 8 years than my daughters. So they had that first group of kids, right? So when they were going through my youth ministry, I met a man at our church who ended up becoming the worship leader of our youth group. And his name is Tim Thetford. And Tim is a guy who I thought, man, I wish I was more like Tim. He has been a Christian longer than me. He has a sweet disposition, incredibly smart, incredibly thoughtful, and younger than me. He is like a younger.
Just for the record, Tim wears superhero shirts as well.
No, he does. And his hair is always, some combination of long facial hair. He's a completely different person. I mean, he's what I was when I was younger, but he's a lot younger than me. Maybe not that. Maybe he's your age, Sean. But the point is, we're still a lot younger
than you.
But the point is, he was more than a decade younger than me, and he was way cooler than me, and I knew that. And my hope was, and I successfully connected him to my kids, because I knew that this guy, who is seen as younger and cooler and more relevant, was going to basically open his mouth and express all the same worldview ideologies, all the same views that I held. He was going to speak nothing that I would disagree with, but it was going to come from a source that wasn't Dad, that wasn't Pop. And that was incredibly powerful for me. Now, that didn't happen by accident. I had to look in my environment, and I saw Tim was coming up in our church. I knew that Tim was the kind of man who I would have chosen, and I pursued that relationship for my kids. And so I would suggest to parents who feel like, hey, they don't want to hear it from me anymore. And that's usually when they're older. So that means that you probably got through your middle school years, you probably got through your elementary years, and this didn't happen. So now you're in your high school years, and you're wondering, what do I do now? If they are connected to a youth group or to a member of your family that they think is an uncle or somebody who they think is cooler, arrange play dates for your teenagers with the mentor of your choice. And that is something that is incredibly powerful going downfield. Don't underestimate that.
We had a couple of comments, Jim, about something you said. I believe it was something you said where you talked about leveraging cultural items for the glory of God. And you mentioned Sean's T-shirt, for example. And then it's something that I meant to talk about in the book. Listen, this is just one more reason, guys, why you need to go buy the book, because there's just so much in this book that we are not able to get to today. But one of the sections in the book on page 72, 10 strategies for connecting with Generation Z, number one was share stories. That stories, including maybe even stories like Thor, are great ways to, they're great wedges into, great openings into larger theological and apologetics conversations. Jim, would you say a little bit more about that? And then maybe Sean, you could pick up on it.
I'm not going to say much. I want Sean to take the line and share this, because Sean has done a good job of leveraging that. But what it requires, I think, us to do is to not disconnect from the culture in which we are living. And it's easier as you get older, I have always been a musician. I always played music. I played in lots of bands, played in lots of worship teams. And I knew as time changed, the styles of music change. And I am not going to get rooted in whatever I was listening to in 1975. I knew that I wanted to be, whatever my kids were listening to, great, open that up to me. I want to know everything about what's happening in music today, so that I continue to appreciate what's happening. And that allows me opportunities then to speak into songs, into music, into culture, into videos, into what is happening on Netflix, what's happening. So Sean, though, has done this a number of times. He's already given you a couple of great examples of how to leverage that. But the importance of that is not to be underestimated. For parents in this book, one of the most important chapters is going to be how to leverage media to make a case for Christian worldview. And I want Sean to take it from there.
Yeah, sure. One of the things I do is I'm always listening for stories that somebody shares with me, or a story I see in the news, a video clip on YouTube, an article, and then I write it down in my phone. And then when I'm at dinner or driving in the car, I just share it with my kids. And the reason is Jesus communicated in two ways, generally speaking. He asked a ton of questions and he told stories. So who's my neighbor? Tells the story of the Good Samaritan. How much shall I forgive my brother? Tells the story of the unmerciful servant. We remember stories. We relate to stories. Stories shape our world view. So I just look for interesting stories. So recently U.S. wins the Women's Soccer Cup. Well, there was actually the story from the Breakpoint that I used specifically and read it to my kids. I know that's why John and your team does the Breakpoint, about the soccer player who was the best at her position, but would not wear the rainbow flag celebrating LGBTQ pride, and it cost her a position on the team. And she gets booed when she goes to play in other places. Well, I just read that to my kids, and they were kind of enwrapped because that's an interesting story. It was relevant, and it caught their attention. And we just had a brief conversation about it, and we moved on. Now, I'll be honest with you, it's not like my kids always sit there and they're like, wow, Dad, feed me stories. We're McDowell, so we listen. I finished one time with my kids, and I'll never forget it. My son was 13. He goes, good speech, Dad, and was kind of giving me a hard time. But that was also his way of feeling free, because he knew I loved him in relationship, to give me a hard time. And I said, all right, your dad, I probably try a little too hard sometimes, but I love you guys. I care about you, and I want you to learn to think Christianly. And because there's that relationship, they'll listen. But there's stories all around us. Just share them in appropriate ways, and that's one way of shaping a kid's worldview.
I think sometimes, Warren, that kids are resisting if what they really think we are interested in purely is, I want you guys to be more like me. There's a sense in which I think young people they kind of feel that way about us as older folks. I want us to be able to have a relationship with our young people so we can actually express to them that I don't want you to be more like me. I want you to be more like the Savior. And that's a very different kind of thing. If you love someone enough, because if it's just about you conforming to what I want for you, then I can see why you might see some resistance in that. But if what you really want is what's best for you, and it's not even what I can conform. I mean, I'm having a struggle with this too, conforming to the image of the Savior. But I know that it's the best thing for me because it's true. So I think that's part of what we want to be able to communicate to our kids. And by the way, sports are one of those areas that I mean, I'm a sports fanatic, okay, except for baseball because it's not a sport. But other than that, I am a sports fanatic. I just want to clean up half the room here. But if you're a guy, and a lot of these questions are coming from men on our Q&A, if you watch sports, we just had the free agency period in NBA. Oh my gosh, there are a number of character formation Christian stories in the free agency period of the NBA. It's ridiculous. These are stories you could leverage to teach character and Christian worldview to your own kids. So I think that there are opportunities out there for us, especially in the narratives that come from sports, that as guys, we can turn a corner and actually talk about why do some teams that behave in a selfless way that comes directly from the teaching of Jesus of Nazareth, why are those teams more successful than teams where people are trying to elevate individuals? And I think that's something that is very powerful, right? There are examples of why Christianity is true all around us. We just haven't been seeing them to share with our kids.
Yeah, that's a great word. And unfortunately, guys, we've only got about 5 minutes left, so we're going to have to kind of land this airplane here in the next couple of minutes. Let me ask and answer one question, though, myself, and it comes from Kenneth. And Kenneth asks, how does one go about establishing or starting a tab ministry? Are there any training materials available for this? And I'll let you guys weigh in on that question, but let me again just mention that that's another reason you need to get the book, because you guys talk a good bit about tab trips and also how you do them and where to kind of go to get some resources and curriculum on that as well. So there's that. Get the book. But anything else to add to that answer, guys?
Yeah, I would say go to John Stonestreet's co-author on the book Navigating Culture. Brett Kunkle is the one who first started setting these trips up for Jim. He took my team and my students for years, and he has a ministry now called Maven. And he sets up these trips and has trained other leaders to go in and work with your group and do them. So in the book, we talk about easier ways you can kind of put these principles into practice without taking a trip to Berkeley, which we would suggest you don't do without having some real professional apologists with you. We've both made some mistakes on those trips we've learned from. But Brett and his team can take you, or get the book and have some practical little ways to put this in, not the full way, but little steps that implement the tab ideas. So Maven is the name of the ministry. Contact Brett's team, and I think he'd be more than happy to work with you if you have enough interested students. It's a game changer, changer.
And he's starting to develop resources so that parents and youth pastors can take these kinds of trips just by training online. You can find this information. If I could elevate one person in this conversation, it would be Brett. Brett has been formational for both of us. He's a dear friend and is at maventruth.com. Maventruth.com. You can begin. He's constantly always re-updating that website. But that's at least a place to connect with him. And he now has a team that can help you train yourself. And he's got videos that are available to help you train yourself to be ready to take and lead these kinds of trips. But again, baby steps. Baby steps. We're not asking you to take the big trip, to take the big step. We get it. There's conversations you can have, things you can do tomorrow that will change the trajectory of your kids. And that's what we want to kind of help our readers to know.
Well, Jim and Sean, thank you so much for being with us this hour. I'm going to ask for you to have a 1 or 2 sentence closing here in just a minute, but let me just do a couple of housekeeping items to bring our hour to a close. Number one is, if I haven't already said it enough, let me just say it again. You guys need to get this book. I love it. The Colson Center thinks a whole lot of it. And you can get this book by just going to breakpoint.org. Right on the front page, you'll see a little pop-up there that says that will show you how to get the book. You click on that pop-up, and it'll take you to a landing page where you will be able to get a copy of this book for yourself. We've already sent out, I think, somewhere around 300 copies of the book this month. We're excited about that. We hope we send out many hundreds more. That's the way for you to get this book, just to go to breakpoint.org. Since both of you mentioned Brett Kunkle, I also wanted to mention that Brett will be joining Jim Wallace, J. Warner Wallace, and Sean McDowell at our Wilberforce Weekend, which is May 15, 16, and 17 of next year. You can go to wilberforceweekend.org in order to find out more about the Wilberforce Weekend and to sign up. And I recommend that you do sign up early. We've got more people signed up for next year's event than we've ever had at this early day. Fairly confident we're going to sell out there. So I would recommend that you go early. Also wanted to mention that we use this format. If you like this format, if this format has been helpful to you, we use this format about 5 times a year in what we call short courses. They are 4-week-long sessions like this, focused on a single topic. And we have one starting in August. And that short course is what would you say? How do you answer tough questions about the Christian faith? And we're going to have Andrew Walker talking about transgenderism, Sandra Glahn talking about sexual harassment. We've got Jay Richards talking about global warming, other topics that we will be focused on during that short course. And we would like for you to sign up for that as well. Again, just go to breakpoint.org and you will see a way to click on the front page to take you to that resource as well. So guys, in the few seconds that we have left, and Sean, let me just start with you. Any final words for those watching and listening today?
Sure. Thanks, Warren, for all your work at the Colson Center and your friendship. To me, the 2 most important worldview ministries are Summit Ministry and the Colson Center, because you understand relationships and you speak truth. So thanks for what you're doing.
Yeah, and
well, God bless you. Thank you for that.
Sometimes, if you follow us, if you follow Sean and I, and you're familiar with our work, you know where to find us online. But maybe you haven't followed and been a part of Colson Center. So I'm a senior fellow with Colson for a reason. My kids grew up listening to the Breakpoint Minute. My son Jimmy would not miss a single day. When he first decided to tithe, where did he send his check? Colson Center. Where does he still send his tithe check? Colson Center. So I just want to introduce you, if you've been following us, but you haven't been a part of Colson Center yet, become a Colson Fellow. There's a fellows program here. If you think, well, it's relationships in combination with authority, you have to know something about this in order to leverage the relationship. Well, what systematic approach can you take to learn something you can share with your kids? It's here at Colson. So you've got a way to do this regionally online that can actually prepare you to have the kinds of conversations we're talking about. So that's why I want to be part of Colson. I've seen what it did in the lives of my own kids, and I hope it'll do that for you as a parent. So don't miss the opportunity to become a Colson Fellow. That will change the way you have dialogues with your kids.
Well, Jim, I appreciate that so much. J. Warner Wallace, Sean McDowell, thank you so much for this book. It's really excellent, and we're so glad to be offering it as our donor premium this month. Thank you for a lifetime of investment in these ideas and your ability to communicate them so clearly to us. I'm just so grateful for that. And for everyone watching and listening, thanks for investing an hour with us today. My prayer is that this hour has been nourishing to you both intellectually and spiritually, and that it will allow you to turn from here to the people with whom you have influence to be able to share these ideas more effectively with them. God bless you. Have a great day, and we look forward to seeing you next time at some Colson Center event.
See you later.
God bless. Goodbye.